Hi, Mrs. Pierce here. Today we are going to talk about using mental math, so your brain, to calculate some pretty percents. So what do I mean by pretty percents? Well, 10% would be a pretty percent, 20% would be pretty, 25 is pretty, 5% could be pretty, 50% could be pretty, and we could go on and on and on. So instead of talking about what it looks like, let's do some. So 10%, let's start there. 10% of a number. First, let's calculate that to a fraction. So percent means out of 100. So 10% would be 10 out of 100. Now that can be simplified. Look, I can divide them both by 0. So that is really 1/10. And 1/10 in decimal form is 0.1. Now that's going to be kind of important to help us later. So whenever we find 10% of something, we could use any of these forms of 10% to help us calculate 10%. So let's get started. So if I was going to calculate 10% of 32, I personally am going to change that to decimal form, and we just said 10% is 0.1. And whenever we take a number of something, of is like times. So I'm going to go 32 times 0.1, because remember, 10% is 1/10, which is 0.1. And then when you multiply it, look what happens when we multiply that out. 1 times 2 is 2, 1 times 3 is 3. I don't need to worry about the zeros, but I do need to worry about that decimal point. I need to move it over one place. So 10% of 32 is 3.2. All right, so what about 10% of 540? I would take 540 times 0.1, because that's another form of 10%. That's nice and pretty. And then when I go to multiply, 1 times 0 is 0, 1 times 4 is 4, 1 times 5 is 5. I don't need to worry about this 0, but I do need to move it over one place. So look what happened. Both times, if I'm multiplying by 0.1, guys, I'm multiplying by 1, right? So it's going to be the same digits. The problem is, though, since it's 1/10, I'm going to need to always just move my decimal point over one place. So at the beginning, I could have said, well, 10% of 540, bam, 54. 10% of 32, bam, 3.2. So it's that easy, guys. 10% of a number, all we need to do is move our decimal point one place to the left. And then we've got 10%. Okay, so if calculating 10% can be done easily, what about these others? So 10% of 80, if we do it the nice and pretty way, like I was just talking about, move the decimal point over, bam, 10% of 80 is 8. Now 5%, let's think about this for a second. 5 is half of 10, so then 5% of 80 should be half of 10% of 80. Well, half of 8 is 4. Done. Look, I didn't even do any multiplication there. And then what about 20%? I'm always going to go back to whatever my 10% is, okay? Always. This is going to be helpful because it's only 10% that we can just move the decimal, but we're going to use that to help us with others. So 20% of 80, well, if I know 10% is 8, 20% is doubled, right? So times 2. So I just need to do 8 doubled, which would be 16. And then 30%, well, I would do times 3. So then I'm going to do times 3. So 8 times 3, 24. Okay, I did all of that in my head, no calculator whatsoever. We could keep going. 40% obviously would be whatever 10% is times 4. 90% would be whatever 10% is times 9, and we could kind of go on forever. There's just a couple more I want to show you. So 50%, we could take 10% and then multiply it by 5. Or, hopefully, you know that 50% is half, right? So if we were calculating 50% by something, we could just divide by 2. So we could just divide by 2. 25%, we could calculate 20% of something, 5% of something, and add them. Or, hopefully, you know that 25% is 1/4. And so if it's 1/4, we could just divide by 4. Should have an error there, right? So there's just two other ways that we could kind of use mental math to help us. Any others that you could think of? If you can think of any other percents that we could calculate nice and easy in our head, jot them down and let your teacher know. Okay, so let's do this. I would like you to pause and try each of these problems. They should be done mentally, so it really should take you about 30 seconds, not long ago at all. I shouldn't see anything written on your paper except for the answers, because you should be able to do this mentally. Okay, so pause it and unpause it when you're done. Okay, so let's talk about these answers here. So 10% of 140, move that decimal point over, bam, 14, that easy. 20% of 140, well, I just calculated 10%, so 20% would be that doubled, so that would be 28. 5% of 140, well, 10% is 14, so 5% would be half of that, 7. 25%, okay, we have two options here. Look, we know that 20% of 140 is 28, and we know that 5% of 140 is 7, so we could add those two together. So if I did that mentally, maybe I could jot down 28 plus 7, and that would give me 35. Okay, there's another way we could do it, because remember we said 25% is the same as 1/4. So I could take 140 divided by 4. So 4 goes into 14 3 times, which is 12. That brings me with 20. 4 goes into 25 times, and look, there's my 35 as well. Okay. Again, try these. Notice I have dollar signs with these now because honestly, most of the time we're dealing with percents. We're going to be talking about money. So all of your answers should have dollar signs with them. So pause this, try these, unpause it when you're done. Okay, 30% of 25. Well, 10% is 2.5. So 30% would be whatever that is times 3. Oops, there's a 3 there. Now I could kind of do that in my head because I know 2.5 times 2 is 5. Add another one and it's going to be 7.5. Now we're talking money, so it'll be $7.50. 50% of 90, well, half of 90 is 45. So half of $90 is $45. 10% of $18.40, move that decimal over, would be $1.84. I don't need that 0 on the end because I already have cents. And then 5% of 150. Well, 10% is 15, so that's 10%. Half of that would be $7.50. Hopefully you got those. If not, ask for help. Just keep practicing more. It's always good to use your brain to practice mental math.